Today's video covers 3 cases that began with a single decision and ended with consequences no one involved expected. A London gang ride-out that ended with 1 man dead, and the people jailed for his murder weren't the ones who pulled the trigger. A cocaine shipment flown in from mainland Europe stopped at the edge of a rural airfield before it could disappear onto the streets. And a young father who disappeared after a late-night raid on an Albanian-run grow house before his body was discovered hours later on isolated moorland. These stories didn't unfold in a moment. What connects them is not just organized crime, but how responsibility was traced backwards. This is the story of 3 cases where actions carried consequences no one could walk away from, and how the investigation slowly uncovered what really happened. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into it. Billy McCullagh was 27 years old when he was killed in July 2020. On the streets of northwest London, he was better known by his nickname, Billy the Kid, a name that carried weight long before it became tragically fitting. He was regarded as a senior and prominent figure within the Harrow Road Boys, a gang deeply embedded in the long-running feud that dominated parts of Harlesden and the surrounding estates. He was regarded as a senior and prominent figure within the Harrow Road Boys, a gang deeply embedded in a long-running feud with their rivals, the thugs of Stonebridge. Northwest London at the time was marked by entrenched rivalries, with territory, reputation, and retaliation driving cycles of violence that had already claimed multiple lives. This rivalry wasn't symbolic or superficial. It was rooted in territory, reputation, and a steady pattern of retaliation that had escalated well before 2020. From 2018 onwards, tensions between the 2 sides repeatedly boiled over, spilling into shootings, stabbings, and serious assaults across neighbouring estates. The conflict had already claimed lives. Courts later heard that the feud included multiple homicides, one of which involved a case of mistaken identity, underlining how unpredictable and indiscriminate the violence had become. Firearms were used openly, and both sides were well aware that retaliation was no longer hypothetical. It was expected. Each incident fed the next. Attacks were answered with reprisals, reputations were defended with force, and any perceived slight risked triggering another round of violence. By mid-2020, the atmosphere between the 2 gangs was described as volatile. It was against this backdrop, a feud already soaked in blood and defined by escalation, that the events of July 2020 unfolded. But that wasn't the full picture. Away from the street reputation, Billy was also a father-to-be, with family members later describing a caring and thoughtful side that rarely aligned with how he was viewed by police or rivals. It was this contrast that would later be acknowledged in court. A man described as having 2 lives running in parallel. With tensions already at breaking point, it would take just one incident to push the rivalry past the point of no return. Before the violence that followed, it's important to understand who was in the car that night, and how their roles would later become central to one of the most unusual murder convictions ever brought in England and Wales. Along with Billy McCullagh was Isa Seed, an associate who would later be shot during the gunfight and survive. What made his role even more prominent was what followed after. We will talk about this in a few minutes. Also present were Adel Yusuf and Daniel Mensah, both trusted members of the same circle, armed and fully aware of why they were heading into rival territory. We will discuss more members and their role in a few minutes. One of them believed they would be the ones facing murder charges by the end of it, because just hours earlier, a separate act of violence had changed everything and set the group on a path they couldn't reverse. The immediate trigger came the day before Billy was killed. A gang associate, whose name has not been public, connected to the Harrow Road Boys was fatally stabbed, an attack understood to be part of the ongoing conflict which we have just discussed earlier. Within Billy's circle, the mood shifted instantly. This was not seen as random violence or something to be absorbed quietly. Members of Billy's group believed the stabbing had been carried out by rival gang members, though individual attackers were not publicly identified at that stage. What mattered to them was not precisely who held the knife, but which gang they believed was responsible. However, it was viewed as a direct act of aggression by their rivals, and one that demanded a response. Rather than preparing defensively or waiting for further retaliation, the group chose to go on the offensive. The decision was made to carry out a revenge ride-out, deliberately entering rival territory to send a message and reassert dominance. Later that night, the group gathered and prepared to move out from St. Raphael's estate, the area associated with the Harrow Road Boys. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction or a chance encounter. What followed was deliberate, organized, and driven by the decision to retaliate. They traveled in a stolen Land Rover, a vehicle chosen for anonymity, impact, and speed. Inside were 4 men, what we have already discussed. They weren't traveling unprepared. At least 2 firearms were taken with them, and the intention was clear. They were heading out expecting confrontation and prepared to use serious violence if they encountered rivals. Their destination was Windrush Road, NW10, deep inside Stonebridge estate. The plan was to launch a surprise attack to catch their rivals off guard and strike first. What they hadn't accounted for was that the surprise would work both ways. At around 3 a.m. on the 16th of July 2020, instead of catching their rivals off guard, the group immediately realized something was wrong. A large number of people were already present in the street, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. What followed was immediate and chaotic. Gunfire erupted almost as soon as the vehicle entered the road. Rather than a one-sided attack, the situation turned into a full exchange of gunfire, with weapons being discharged from outside the vehicle and from within it. Investigators later established that at least 8 9mm rounds were fired towards the Land Rover. Bullets struck the vehicle multiple times, ripping through its bodywork as shots flew in all directions. 2 of those bullets hit Billy McCullagh in the back. Another round struck Iserseed in the leg, seriously injuring him. As the shooting unfolded, Billy exited the vehicle. Whether he was trying to escape, had already been hit, or was forced out by the chaos was never fully established. What is clear is that he was left behind in the street, wounded and exposed, as the Land Rover fled the scene. Within moments, the revenge ride-out had collapsed into panic, and the consequences of that decision were about to become irreversible. What had begun as a planned retaliation dissolved into panic and damage control. Iserseed, badly wounded from the gunshot to his leg, was taken to hospital rather than left at the scene. Helping him was Liban Farah, another associate who would later play a key role in trying to erase what had just happened. The stolen Land Rover was driven away and later set on fire, deliberately destroyed in an attempt to remove forensic evidence linking the group to the shooting. It was a clear and calculated effort to sever the trail back to those involved. Attention then turned to the weapons. Firearms used during the ride-out were hidden and passed on, eventually ending up with George Orgy. When police later recovered weapons connected to the case, they included handguns and a silencer, reinforcing just how heavily armed the group had been that night. Every step taken after the shooting pointed to one thing: an urgent attempt to distance themselves from the violence. But despite those efforts, investigators were already beginning to piece together what really happened, and the focus was about to shift from the shooters to the men who had chosen to be there in the first place. What police did have was evidence of everything that led up to the shooting. Detectives built their case using a combination of mobile phone data, CCTV footage, forensic evidence, and vehicle analysis. Phone records mapped movements and communications before and after the ride-out. CCTV traced the stolen Land Rover's journey into Stonebridge and its escape from the scene. Forensics linked the burned-out vehicle to the shooting, while firearms recovered later connected back to the group's preparations. The investigation made one thing clear: Billy McCullagh and the men with him had not stumbled into danger by accident. They had traveled together, armed, into rival territory, fully aware of the likely response. With no identifiable shooter to charge, prosecutors took an unusual and highly deliberate approach. Rather than focusing on who fired which bullet, they focused on shared responsibility. The case was framed as what became known as a homicide homicide, a legal argument rarely used and never before tested at this scale. The prosecution's case was that the defendants had knowingly created a lethal situation. By launching an armed ride-out into enemy territory, they accepted that gunfire was not just possible, but virtually certain. They went equipped with firearms, expecting resistance, and agreed as a group to both shoot and be shot at. In court, jurors heard that it didn't matter whose bullet struck Billy. What mattered was that the defendants chose to engage in a gun battle, understanding that someone could and likely would be killed. In doing so, the prosecution argued they were all equally responsible for the outcome. It was a radical shift in focus. The investigation no longer centered on the unseen shooters across the street, but on the decisions made before the first shot was fired. And it was that legal reasoning, turning attention away from the trigger and onto the choice to pull up armed, that would redefine how this case was judged and send shockwaves through the courtroom. The case against the surviving members of the ride-out went to trial at the Old Bailey, where proceedings would last almost 3 months. At the center of the trial were Isa Seed, Adel Yusuf, and Daniel Mensah. All three denied wrongdoing. All three accepted they were present, but none accepted responsibility for Billy McCullagh's death. The Crown made clear that this was a case of joint enterprise pushed to its furthest edge. After nearly 28 hours of deliberation, the jury returned unanimous verdicts. Seed, Yusuf, and Mensah were all found guilty of murder, despite the fact that none of them fired the fatal shots and the shooters from the rival gang were never identified. They were also convicted of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm with intent and possession of a firearm with intent. At sentencing, Judge Philip Katz KC addressed the defendants directly. He said the ride-out was a planned act of revenge, describing it as a vengeful sortie that had ended in crushing defeat. Isa Seed, Adel Yusuf, and Daniel Mensah were each sentenced to life imprisonment, with minimum terms of 29 years before parole eligibility. Their sentences also included concurrent terms for related offences. Life imprisonment with a minimum of 16 years. For conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm with intent. 15 years imprisonment for possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Isa Seed's sentence was later partially reduced on appeal, with his minimum term lowered to 26 years and 350 days, after judges accepted limited mitigation relating to his role and circumstances. The convictions themselves were upheld as safe, with the Court of Appeal rejecting arguments that the legal approach was flawed. Adel Yusuf and Daniel Mensah both failed in their appeals, with the Court of Appeal confirming that their life sentences and minimum terms of 29 years should stand. Liban Farah was convicted of perverting the course of justice. His sentencing was dealt with separately, with reports confirming the conviction, but not publicly detailing the length of the custodial term. George Orji was convicted of possessing an imitation firearm with intent. Again, public reporting confirms the conviction, but does not disclose the precise sentence imposed for him as well. George Orji received a custodial sentence for possessing an imitation firearm with intent after weapons linked to the group were recovered from an address associated with him, whereas Anu Adelaya was fully acquitted of all firearm-related charges, with the jury finding insufficient evidence to link her to the handling or storage of weapons. But while one investigation unfolded in gunfire and chaos, another was already moving silently. Just one flight, one suitcase, and a belief that no one was watching. At the center of this case were Richard David Farmer and Blaine Harvey, both aged 39 and both based in Coventry. On the surface, there was nothing about them that suggested they were about to handle one of the largest cocaine shipments intercepted that year. The two men were not casual associates. Phone analysis later showed regular ongoing communication, with messages and call patterns that placed them firmly within the same operation rather than acting independently. Investigators would come to believe their roles were clearly divided, with one tasked with collection and the other prepared to handle onward movement. Crucially, Farmer and Harvey were not operating alone. Evidence presented in court placed them within a wider organized crime group, connected to suppliers overseas and supported by logistics stretching across multiple counties. Their job was not to import the drugs themselves, but to make sure a high-value shipment could quietly disappear once it landed. And that plan appeared to be working. The method chosen was deliberate and calculated. Instead of using ports, ferries, or commercial flights, the shipment was moved using a private light aircraft, a tactic designed to sidestep the layers of scrutiny that come with conventional travel and freight. The route itself was tightly planned. The aircraft departed from Belgium, crossed into the UK, and landed briefly at Denethorpe Airfield in Northamptonshire, a quiet, rural strip far removed from major airports. The drugs were offloaded quickly, concealed inside a single-wheeled suitcase, before the plane continued its journey onward to Ireland, creating distance between the suppliers and the drop-off point. For organized crime groups, private aviation offers several advantages. Smaller airfields often have minimal staff, limited security infrastructure, and far less routine inspection. Flights can be scheduled at short notice, routes can be altered easily, and the entire operation can be kept fast, discreet, and compartmentalized. On paper, it was the kind of setup that had worked countless times before. But what Farmer and Harvey didn't realize was that this flight had already attracted attention long before its wheels touched the runway. By the time the aircraft approached Northamptonshire airspace, this was no longer a chance interception. Officers from the National Crime Agency had been tracking Richard David Farmer for some time, building a picture of his movements, contacts, and behavior. What concerned investigators was not just where he went, but how deliberately his routine changed in the days leading up to the flight. On the morning of the 23rd of February, 2022, Farmer drove from Coventry toward Denethorpe Airfield. Surveillance teams watched as he arrived shortly after a light aircraft landed from Belgium, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The operation unfolded quickly and quietly. A black-wheeled suitcase was removed from the aircraft and carried across the runway. There was no formal unloading process, no hangar entry, and no paperwork. Instead, the case was placed directly at the edge of the runway where Farmer was waiting in his Volvo. He drove forward, opened the boot, and loaded the suitcase himself. At the same time, investigators were monitoring Blaine Harvey, who was positioned away from the airfield, ready to meet Farmer once the drugs were safely off-site. Phone data later showed the pair were in regular contact before, during, and after the drop-off, confirming this was a coordinated handover rather than a solo run. To anyone unfamiliar with organized crime logistics, the scene might have looked uneventful, but to the officers watching, this was the critical moment, the point where suspicion turned into certainty. And as Farmer turned his car toward the exit, carrying what investigators believed to be millions of pounds worth of cocaine, the surveillance phase ended and enforcement moved in. As Richard David Farmer drove away from Denethorpe Airfield, the operation moved into its final phase. Officers allowed him to leave the immediate vicinity of the runway, ensuring the transfer was complete and removing any doubt about possession. Moments later, armed units closed in. Farmer's vehicle was brought to a controlled stop by armed officers who approached with weapons drawn. Body-worn camera footage later released shows Farmer being ordered from the car and forced face down onto the ground at gunpoint as officers secured the scene and searched the vehicle. Inside the boot, officers found the black-wheeled suitcase that had been loaded minutes earlier. When it was opened, its contents left no ambiguity. The case contained 50 tightly wrapped packages, each sealed in brown tape, consistent with wholesale cocaine packaging seen in large-scale importations. The haul weighed approximately 50 kilograms, with an estimated street value of £4 million. Investigators later confirmed the drugs were Class A cocaine, intended for distribution across multiple regions of England rather than a single local market. For Farmer, the moment was decisive, but while the seizure had stopped the drugs reaching the streets, the investigation was far from over, because attention was now turning to the wider network and to the man who had been waiting nearby, ready to help move the shipment on. With the drugs seized and Farmer in custody, investigators shifted focus from the arrest itself to what sat behind it. Forensic analysis of Farmer's mobile phone quickly proved critical, what we have already discussed. The data confirmed that the two men were acting in tandem. Investigators also uncovered evidence that the shipment was not destined for a single area, but was intended to be moved across Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire, Coventry, Kent and Essex, indicating a distribution plan spanning much of England. In April 2022, officers moved to arrest Blaine Harvey at his home in Coventry. By that stage, investigators were confident they had sufficient evidence to link him directly to the conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, even though he had not physically drugs. The operation did not stop in the UK. After dropping off the cocaine, the aircraft had continued its journey to Ireland. When it landed at Waterford Airport, it was met by Garda and customs officers acting on shared intelligence. 3 men on board, nationals of Sweden and Lithuania, were arrested, along with the seizure of mobile phones and cash. The international element of the case was coordinated through Interpol, with European arrest warrants issued as investigators worked across borders to identify roles within the supply chain. The 3 men were extradited to Sweden, where they were later convicted of drug-related offences. What began as a single suitcase on a rural runway had now exposed an operation stretching from mainland Europe to the UK and Ireland, and the focus was turning back to the courts, where Farmer and Harvey would soon have to answer for their roles. The case against Richard David Farmer and Blaine Harvey was brought before Northampton Crown Court, where prosecutors laid out the full scale of the operation uncovered by the investigation. Both men denied knowingly being involved in the importation of cocaine. However, the jury was presented with detailed evidence showing coordination, planning, and clear intent to supply Class A drugs on a large scale. On the 16th of July, 2025, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both defendants. Sentencing followed shortly afterwards. Richard David Farmer was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. Blaine Harvey received a sentence of 12 years and 6 months, with the judge noting his involvement in coordinating the onward movement of the shipment. For Farmer and Harvey, the operation ended not with quiet distribution, but with long prison sentences. And for the network behind them, it marked the collapse of a carefully planned route into the UK. In the second case, police intervened just in time, stopping a shipment before it vanished. The final case begins where intervention came too late. Rhys Thompson was 29 years old and from Moss Side, Manchester, an area that shaped much of his early life. To those who knew him best, he was better known by his nickname, Vapes, a name used by friends and family long before it appeared in court documents and headlines. At the time of his death, Rhys was working as a courier driver, a job that kept him on the road and supporting those closest to him. He had previously planned to attend Salford University, but chose a different path after becoming a father, putting responsibility ahead of ambition. Family members described him as a devoted dad and loving partner, someone whose priorities had shifted firmly toward providing and being present. In tributes released after his death, relatives spoke of a man who was warm-hearted, funny, and deeply loyal to the people he cared about. On many occasions, his family said he had the biggest heart. He would always help when he could. But behind the ordinary routines of work and family life, something was unfolding. Something that would pull Rhys into a chain of events lasting only hours, but with consequences that would stretch on for years. In the early hours of Thursday 13th May 2021, Rhys Thompson left Moss Side with 3 other men who were not mentioned in an online source, travelling to Delaunay's Road in Crumpsall, North Manchester. Investigators later established that this journey was deliberate, not incidental. According to evidence outlined during the inquest and police investigation, the group's purpose was to tax a cannabis grow believed to be operating in the area. Intelligence indicated the GRO was linked to an Albanian organized crime group, suggesting the visit carried an inherent risk of violence. Sometime around 3:40 a.m., the group arrived on Delaunay's Road. What they expected to find remains unclear, but what followed was not a brief confrontation. Investigators believe that instead of encountering an unprotected property, Rees and the others were met by a group of men already prepared for violence. Evidence later presented pointed to an ambush. A 999 call made during the incident reported a fight involving multiple men armed with metal bars, indicating the attackers were equipped before the confrontation began. The situation escalated rapidly into a violent disturbance. As the violence unfolded, Rees attempted to escape the scene. He entered a white transit van parked nearby and tried to drive away. However, the attempt failed. The van is attacked by the gang, stopping it before Rees could leave the area. What happened next marked the last confirmed sighting of Rees alive. According to findings later outlined at the inquest, Rees was dragged from the van by Albanian crew and was assaulted at the scene, and then forced into another vehicle. That vehicle left the area shortly afterwards. By the time police officers arrived in response to the emergency call, the disturbance had ended. Delaunay's Road was quiet again, and the vehicles involved were gone. At that moment, it was unclear where he had been taken, who had taken him, or what had happened to him after he was removed from the van. Within hours, investigators would discover just how far the consequences of those events had travelled. At 6:40 a.m. on 13th of May 2021, police in West Yorkshire were called to reports of a body found on a remote private road in Rishworth, Calderdale. The location was starkly different from where Rees had last been seen just hours earlier, a quiet stretch of moorland near Boothwood Reservoir, miles from any residential area. Officers arriving at the scene quickly confirmed the body was that of Rees Thompson. There was no attempt to conceal him. He had been left out in the open, on a track more commonly used by walkers and locals than passing traffic. The isolation of the spot only deepened the mystery of how and why he had been brought there. A post-mortem examination revealed the full extent of what Rees Thompson had endured in the hours before his death. The findings were stark. Rees had suffered 9 separate blows to the head, inflicted with a heavy blunt object, injuries described by experts as severe and fatal. In addition to the head injuries, he had sustained 2 broken hands, a fractured forearm, and a broken leg, alongside extensive bruising, lacerations, and abrasions. Some of these injuries were identified as defensive wounds, suggesting Rees had tried to protect himself during the attack. The inquest also heard that parcel tape had been found around Rees's wrists and neck when his body was discovered. A length of tape was located nearby at the scene. While early speculation raised the possibility of strangulation, the forensic pathologist concluded there was no evidence that the tape had compressed his neck. Instead, it was believed to have been used either as a restraint or to assist in moving his body. The official cause of death was confirmed as head injuries. The assault was described as prolonged and vicious, with no sign of a single fatal blow, but rather a sustained attack over time. In the days following the discovery on the moors, detectives from Greater Manchester Police launched a full homicide inquiry under Operation Linnet. From the outset, investigators treated Rees Thompson's death as a targeted attack linked directly to the disturbance in Crumpsall just hours earlier. Police confirmed the investigation remained active and ongoing, with officers continuing to analyze CCTV footage, phone data, vehicle movements, and forensic material gathered from multiple locations. Public appeals were repeatedly issued, urging anyone who had seen or heard anything in Crumpsall or the Rishworth area during the early hours of 13th May to come forward, even if the information seemed insignificant. Over the course of the investigation, multiple arrests were made across Greater Manchester and Cambridgeshire. Men aged between their mid-20s and late 30s were detained on suspicion of murder or conspiracy to murder, questioned at length, and had their movements, phones, and associates examined. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, those arrested were released pending further inquiries, reflecting the complexity of proving individual responsibility. As the inquiry progressed, detectives made a fifth arrest, signaling a shift in focus. Investigators began exploring a conspiracy to murder angle, examining whether Reese's death was the result of a coordinated plan rather than a spontaneous escalation of violence. This broadened the scope of the case, but also raised the evidential bar prosecutors would need to meet. Police confirmed the investigation remained active and ongoing. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK crime documentaries.